Cowboy Jack Cooper had always known the wilderness better than any man. The biting winds, the silent nights, and the lonely days, they had all shaped him into the man he was today. But nothing in his years of solitude could have prepared him for the moment he stepped into that dusty town square. "I won't leave her," he muttered under his breath, his voice steady but determined. "Not while there's breath in my body." The crowd was gathered around her, murmuring in hatred and fear, their eyes fixed on the Apache woman tied to the gallows. Her name was Nayeli. She stood tall, her dark eyes fixed on the dirt below, a quiet defiance in the way she held her posture. The sheriff, a man named Brennan, stood beside her, his hand resting nervously on the lever. He wasn't sure about this. He didn't have the stomach for it, but the town wanted justice, and they demanded it be swift. Jack Cooper had heard the rumors, the wild accusations. They said she had killed a settler, a man with a family. But Jack knew something wasn't right. He knew at the moment he saw her standing there. There was no evidence, no proof, and yet they were ready to hang her. "We've got to make an example of her," someone shouted from the crowd. "No Apache should be allowed to live." Jack's eyes narrowed, his hand slowly resting on the worn leather of his gun belt. He had always hated the way people could be so quick to judge. He had learned long ago that things were rarely as they seemed in the West. His boots made a soft thud as he walked toward the center of the square, the murmur of the crowd quieting for a brief moment. Nayeli's eyes flickered up to meet his, and for a moment, their gazes locked. She didn't speak, but there was something in her eyes that made Jack's chest tighten. It wasn't fear, not really. It was something deeper, something resigned. She knew what was coming. But Jack wasn't about to let that happen, not while he was standing there. "She doesn't deserve this," Jack called out, his voice clear, cutting through the tension like a blade. "I don't care what you say. I won't let you hang her without a reason." The crowd shifted uneasily, eyes darting to one another, unsure of what to make of this sudden challenge. The sheriff looked uneasy, his face pale under the hot sun. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "This is justice, Cooper. She's guilty, and we're doing what's right for the town," Sheriff Brennan said, his voice shaky but authoritative. Jack didn't back down. "You call this justice?" he asked, his voice rising. "There's no proof. You're condemning her based on nothing but your hatred for her people." The crowd went silent. For a moment, Jack felt the weight of their gazes, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't. Not now. "You've all heard the stories, the rumors. But I know better," Jack continued, his eyes now fixed on Nayeli, who still stood quietly. "I won't let you make an innocent woman pay for a crime she didn't commit." There was a long pause, the only sound the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. Then, someone in the crowd spoke up. "Let him be, Sheriff. Let him speak." It was a man Jack didn't recognize, but his voice carried weight. Others began to murmur in agreement. The sheriff hesitated, his fingers twitching on the lever. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Finally, the sheriff stepped back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "But if she's guilty, it's on your head, Cooper." Jack's gaze never wavered as he turned to Nayeli. She was still standing tall, her head held high despite the situation. She had been through so much, Jack could see that in the weariness of her posture, in the way she looked at him. Without another word, Jack moved closer to her, his voice low. "I'm not leaving you behind," he said. "Not while I can still fight for you." Nayeli's eyes softened slightly, but she didn't speak. It was enough. Jack knew she understood. He stepped away from her, turning to face the crowd once more. The people who had gathered, eager for a show of justice, now stood in quiet shock. They had expected a different kind of fight, but they weren't going to get it. Not from Jack Cooper. "We'll find the truth," Jack declared. "And if you want to see justice, then you'll let it be done the right way." The sheriff didn't move, and neither did the crowd. The tension in the air was palpable, but Jack held his ground. The town may have wanted blood, but Jack wasn't going to give it to them. Not without a fight. And this time, he was going to make sure the right side of justice won. The crowd shifted uneasily, eyes flicking between Jack Cooper and the sheriff. The heat of the midday sun beat down on the dusty streets of the small frontier town, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze in place. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jack stood firm, his eyes locked on Nayeli, who had not yet moved a muscle. She was still bound, her hands tightly shackled, but her posture had subtly shifted. There was a quiet strength in her, a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the space around them. Jack could feel it, a kind of weightless calm in the storm of hostility that had gripped the town. The sheriff cleared his throat, his voice barely audible as he spoke to the crowd, his words slow and unsure. "We do what must be done," Sheriff Brennan said, though even he seemed unsure of the words coming from his own mouth. Jack didn't respond. He didn't have to. The silence between them spoke volumes. A few members of the crowd, still skeptical but uncertain, began to murmur among themselves. Jack's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "I won't let you make this mistake," he said, his voice strong, his words carrying a quiet but undeniable authority. For a long moment, the sheriff stood frozen. Then, with a deep sigh, he took a step back, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his position. The crowd parted slightly as if they had been waiting for permission, but Jack didn't wait for them. His attention never wavered from Nayeli. "I'll get you out of here," Jack muttered to her, though it was unclear if she could hear him. Her eyes, though tired and worn, held a glint of something, perhaps gratitude, perhaps curiosity, but she did not speak. Jack took a slow, deliberate step towards her, not taking his eyes off the sheriff. He was ready to move, but he needed to know the sheriff's next move. The townspeople continued to watch in stunned silence, unsure of what would come next. Some of them had expected Jack to give in, to back down, but they didn't know him. Jack had never been one to give up easily, especially when it came to something as right as this. As Jack moved closer to Nayeli, the air grew heavier with the expectation of what would happen next. But the sheriff, seeing the determination in Jack's eyes, finally lowered his hand from the lever, signaling the end of the immediate threat. A collective sigh seemed to pass through the crowd, but the tension didn't completely dissipate. Jack reached Nayeli's side, carefully and gently, as though he was afraid of disturbing the fragile peace that had settled over them. With one swift motion, he untied the ropes binding her wrists, allowing her to move her arms freely for the first time in hours. She didn't make a sound. She didn't move at all, except to glance at Jack, her eyes filled with a quiet, unspoken question. "Let's go," Jack said softly, his voice carrying more than just a command. It was an invitation, a promise. Nayeli didn't hesitate. Her feet shuffled slightly as she stepped away from the gallows, moving toward Jack. She didn't look back at the sheriff or the crowd. She simply followed him, her every step an echo of the struggle that had led her to this point. As they moved through the crowd, Jack could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on them. Some were watching with curiosity, others with disdain, but Jack didn't care. He wasn't there to win the crowd's favor. He was there to do what was right. He was there to give Nayeli the chance she deserved. As they reached the edge of the square, Jack turned to face the town once more, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "This isn't over," he called out, his tone resolute. "The truth will come out. And when it does, we'll all have to answer for what we've done." There was no response from the crowd, no cheers or jeers. Just silence. Jack felt the weight of that silence press down on him, but he didn't let it break his resolve. He turned back to Nayeli, offering her a small, reassuring smile. They didn't speak as they walked out of the town square and into the quiet of the open road ahead of them. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt a sense of hope rise within him. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like the right road. Jack had done what he could to right a wrong. Now, he and Nayeli would face whatever came next together. And that was enough for him. Jack Cooper and Nayeli walked silently down the dirt road that led out of town. The evening sun cast a warm glow over the landscape, but Jack's thoughts were far from peaceful. The quiet around them was a stark contrast to the tension of the town square, but Jack knew it wouldn't last. He could feel the weight of what they had just done pressing on him, but he had no regrets. He had done what was right, and now he and Nayeli had to keep moving. The road stretched ahead, empty and wide, but Jack didn't see the freedom in it that he once would have. His gaze kept flicking back to the town behind them. He had defied the law. He had stood against an entire town's judgment, and while he was sure he had done the right thing, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows grew longer as they walked, but there was no sound of pursuit. The town had made its decision. The sheriff might have backed down for now, but Jack knew it wouldn't be long before someone in town would remember Nayeli's face and what he had done. The thought weighed heavily on him, but he didn't let it show. He kept his pace steady, walking beside Nayeli, who had been silent since they left the square. She hadn't said a word, but Jack could tell she was processing everything that had just happened. He didn't press her. She would speak when she was ready. As they reached a small creek, Jack stopped, kneeling by the water to take a drink. He looked up at Nayeli, who stood a few feet away, watching the water flow by. Her face was impassive, but there was something in her eyes, something that Jack couldn't quite read. He rose to his feet and walked over to her. "We'll keep moving," he said softly. "It's not safe to stop for too long." She nodded but didn't respond. Jack didn't expect her to. He wasn't sure what to say to her either. He had saved her from the gallows, but now they were both on the run. Jack had lived alone for years, but this was different. He had never had someone depending on him like this. He had never had someone like Nayeli with him on the road, facing an uncertain future. As they continued down the path, the silence between them grew more comfortable. They were walking through a world of their own now, one that didn't belong to the town or the sheriff or anyone else. The wilderness was theirs, and that was something Jack could hold on to. He had always known the land, trusted it in a way that few others did. It was a place where he could be himself, where things made sense. But now, with Nayeli at his side, it felt different. The land was still the same, but the weight of what they had done was heavy on his shoulders. It wasn't just the town they were escaping. It was the judgment of the world, the misunderstanding of who they were and what they stood for. And yet, as the night fell and the stars began to twinkle above them, Jack felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. They were together, and that was all that mattered. As they found a small clearing to set up camp for the night, Jack built a small fire, the crackling flames a comforting sound in the quiet wilderness. He had food for them, dried jerky, and some bread he had packed for the journey. As he handed a small piece of bread to Nayeli, their fingers brushed for a moment, and Jack felt a jolt of warmth spread through him. He didn't know what this was between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but there was something, a bond, a connection forged in the fire of their shared struggle. Nayeli looked at him, her expression unreadable, but for the first time, Jack saw a flicker of something like trust in her eyes. She took the bread from him without a word, and they ate in silence, the fire between them casting long shadows on the ground. As the night grew darker, Jack leaned back against a tree, staring up at the stars. The wilderness felt vast, endless, but with Nayeli here, it didn't seem so lonely. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if the town would come after them, or if they would find a safe place to hide. But he knew one thing for certain. They were alive, and they were free, for now. And that had to be enough. The morning came slowly, the sun rising in the distance over the horizon, casting long shadows across the open plain. Jack Cooper woke first, his body stiff from the cold night air, but the fire still burned, its embers glowing faintly in the early light. He stretched, his muscles aching from the long walk, but there was something about the quiet of the wilderness that eased his mind. It wasn't the same as the bustling town they had just left behind, a place full of suspicion and fear. Here, the world felt different. It felt like they were truly alone, like they could breathe without the weight of judgment pressing down on them. Jack glanced over at Nayeli, who was still sleeping, her dark hair tangled in the morning breeze. She looked peaceful, almost at ease, but Jack knew better than to assume things were simple. He had seen the way she carried herself, the quiet strength in her movements, the way her eyes had hardened when they left the town. She had been through more than Jack could imagine. She had faced dangers that most couldn't understand, and now they were both on the run. He could feel the weight of it all. He had made the decision to stand up for her, but he knew that the consequences of that decision weren't over. He wasn't sure where they would go next, or how long they could stay hidden, but for now, they had each other. And that was something Jack had never expected. He had always lived alone, content with his solitude. But with Nayeli by his side, it was different. He wasn't sure if it was guilt or something else, but Jack found himself wanting to protect her, to keep her safe. As he prepared to break camp, Jack moved quietly so as not to disturb her. He gathered the firewood and packed up their things, his thoughts drifting to the days ahead. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. Eventually, someone would come looking for them. Jack wasn't afraid of confrontation, but he wasn't sure what kind of trouble they would face next. When Nayeli finally woke, she sat up slowly, stretching her arms above her head and rubbing the sleep from her eyes. She glanced at Jack, offering him a silent nod of acknowledgement. There was no need for words. They both knew what had to be done. After a few moments of quiet, she stood and helped him pack up the remaining supplies. Jack had never been a man of many words, and neither was Nayeli. Their communication was mostly through gestures and looks, a silent understanding that had grown between them since they first met. As they finished packing, Jack led the way, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path as they headed east, toward the mountains. He didn't know where they were going, but he had an idea of what they needed, a place to hide, a place where they could lay low until things calmed down. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jack had never been one to shy away from uncertainty. He had learned long ago that the best way to survive in the wilderness was to keep moving, to always stay one step ahead. As they walked, the wind picked up, swirling around them, and carrying with it the scent of pine and earth. Jack noticed Nayeli glance around as they moved through the trees, her eyes scanning the area as if she were looking for something. He knew she had lived her life in the wild, just as he had, and she was always alert, always aware of her surroundings. He couldn't help but admire that about her. She wasn't like the women he had known in town. She wasn't weak or dependent. She was strong, resourceful, and capable of taking care of herself. As they climbed a small ridge, Jack stopped for a moment, looking back at the valley they had just crossed. The town was barely visible now, a speck on the horizon. He couldn't help but wonder if they were safe, if they could truly escape the life they had left behind. Nayeli stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on the rough bark of a nearby tree. Her expression was unreadable, but Jack could tell she was thinking the same thing. They had both chosen to leave the town behind, but they were still tethered to it, to the fear and the uncertainty that came with defying it. "We'll be okay," Jack said, breaking the silence. Nayeli turned to look at him, her eyes meeting his for the first time in hours. She didn't speak, but she gave a slight nod, a gesture of agreement. It wasn't much, but Jack knew it was enough. For now, it was enough. They kept walking, the landscape changing as they ventured deeper into the wilderness. The path grew steeper, the trees thicker, and the air colder. Jack kept his pace steady, his thoughts drifting to the future, to the uncertain road ahead. He didn't know how long they would have to keep running, but he knew they couldn't stop. They had no choice. As the sun began to set, they made camp in a small clearing by a stream. Jack built the fire, the flames casting long shadows across the ground. They ate in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Jack looked at Nayeli as she ate, her face illuminated by the flickering light of the fire. He still didn't know much about her, but he had come to trust her. And that was something Jack didn't do easily. He had lived his life alone, relying only on himself. But with Nayeli by his side, he wasn't so sure anymore. Maybe, just maybe, they could find something better out here, away from the town and the life they had left behind. The night grew colder, and Jack pulled his coat tighter around him, watching the fire crackle. Nayeli sat a little farther away, her back against a tree, her eyes distant as she stared into the flames. Jack wasn't sure what was going through her mind, but he could feel the weight of everything that had happened. It wasn't just the town they were escaping. It was the past, the life they had both been running from. And now, they had each other. For better or worse, they were in this together. The next morning, the air was crisp, and the silence of the wilderness stretched out before them. Jack Cooper had already started the fire, the glow of the flames flickering in the early light. He had woken early, as was his habit, and had taken a moment to think about the road ahead. There was no clear plan, no sure destination. But there was one thing Jack knew for certain. He couldn't turn back. Not now. Not after everything they had left behind. He glanced over at Nayeli, who was sitting by the stream, her eyes fixed on the water, lost in thought. Jack could tell she was still processing everything that had happened. He didn't blame her. What they had done, what they were doing, wasn't simple. It was a choice that would change everything. The weight of it was heavy, but neither of them had the luxury of second-guessing. "Are you ready to move?" Jack asked, his voice quiet, as if he didn't want to disturb the peace around them. Nayeli didn't answer at first. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable. But after a moment, she nodded, slowly, acknowledging his words. Jack stood up, dusting off his pants, and packed away their camp. It wasn't a long process. They didn't have much, just the essentials. As he gathered their things, he noticed how much more quietly Naeli moved now, how she seemed more attuned to her surroundings. She had always been careful, but now, it was as if she had become one with the land itself. Jack respected that. They both knew how to survive out here, but there was something about Naeli's quiet confidence that made Jack admire her even more. As they set off, the trees parted and the wide plains of the wilderness opened up before them. Jack led the way, his boots crunching softly on the path. He didn't know where they were headed, but he trusted that the land would guide them. The sun was high in the sky now, and Jack could feel the heat of the day creeping in. He kept his pace steady, walking alongside Naeli, who was moving with a silent grace, her steps almost invisible on the dirt trail. As they walked, the air grew warmer, and Jack felt the sweat begin to trickle down the back of his neck. It wasn't an uncomfortable heat, but the sun was relentless in this part of the country. "We should find shelter before the sun sets," Jack said after a while. "There's a pass up ahead that should provide some cover. It won't be much, but it will keep us out of sight." Naeli gave him a brief nod, and they continued forward in silence. Jack didn't feel the need to fill the quiet with words. He was used to silence. But there was something about having Naeli by his side that made the silence feel less heavy. It wasn't lonely anymore. They reached the pass by late afternoon, the rocky cliffs towering on either side, creating a natural barrier from the open plains. Jack found a small spot near the base of one of the cliffs and began to set up camp again. This time, they didn't build a fire. It was better to stay hidden. The sky above them was clear, the stars starting to appear as the sun dipped lower behind the horizon. Jack and Naeli sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but both aware of the shared weight of their situation. Jack glanced over at her. "Do you ever think about going back?" he asked. The question wasn't one he had planned to ask, but it came out before he could stop it. Naeli turned her head to look at him, her expression still unreadable. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, and Jack began to think she wasn't going to respond. But then she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "I don't think I have a choice," she said softly. "I can't go back to that life. I won't." Jack nodded slowly, understanding. He didn't know much about her past, but he could tell that whatever it was, it had shaped her into the person she was today. "I won't make you go back," Jack said, his voice firm. "We'll find a place. Somewhere far from all of this." Naeli gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for her strength. She had been through so much, and yet she carried herself with quiet dignity. They didn't need to speak further. The unspoken understanding between them was enough. Jack sat back against the rocks, gazing up at the stars. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other. And for now, that was enough. As the days passed, Jack and Naeli moved deeper into the wilderness. The land grew wilder, the path more rugged, and the trees denser. They had been walking for days now, with only the barest shelter at night, a place to rest and gather their strength before moving on again. The wilderness, once a place of solitude and peace for Jack, now felt like a constant reminder of the dangers they faced. The world outside the safety of the town was unfamiliar, unforgiving, and unpredictable. But despite the harsh conditions, Jack felt something stirring within him, a sense of purpose he hadn't had in years. Naeli's presence was steady, like the mountain winds that never seemed to stop. She was quiet, but Jack had learned to appreciate the silence between them. It wasn't uncomfortable or awkward. It was as if their words didn't need to be spoken. They both knew what was at stake, and that was enough. One afternoon, after a long day of walking, they arrived at a small clearing near a stream. The trees here were taller, their leaves rustling in the breeze. Jack set down his pack, stretching his aching shoulders. He hadn't realized how tired he was until he finally stopped moving. "We'll stay here for the night," Jack said, his voice hoarse from the dry air. Naeli nodded, wordlessly setting down her own pack. She looked around the clearing, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. Jack admired her ability to stay alert, always looking ahead. She had been through so much, and yet, she never seemed afraid. Jack, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. It was the same feeling he'd had back in the town, an unsettling sense of being watched. He had never been one to let fear control him, but he couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at the back of his mind. "I'm going to scout the area," Jack said, his voice low. Stay here. Naeli gave him a brief nod, her eyes never leaving him. Jack could tell she didn't need to be told what to do, but he said it anyway. He moved quickly, covering the ground with practiced ease, his boots barely making a sound on the forest floor. He didn't stray too far from the clearing, keeping the trees between him and the open sky. It wasn't long before he found what he was looking for, a small trail, barely visible in the thick underbrush. Jack knelt down, brushing his fingers over the dirt. The trail was fresh, but it wasn't the kind of path left by a settler or a cowboy. This was something else. It was the unmistakable sign of someone on the move. Jack's instincts flared. He stood up, quickly, retracing his steps back to the clearing. Naeli was still there, her back to a tree, waiting for him. Her face was calm, but Jack could see the tension in the way she held herself. There's someone out there, Jack said, his voice low. Not far. Naeli's eyes narrowed, her gaze flicking toward the trees. She stood up, moving silently toward Jack. We should leave, she said, her voice steady. Now. Jack nodded, his hand instinctively going to the rifle at his side. He had learned long ago that caution was the key to survival in these parts. They couldn't afford to take any chances. They moved quickly, retracing their steps back into the forest, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. Jack led the way, his senses heightened, listening for any sounds that might indicate someone was following them. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours as they walked, their feet making no sound on the soft earth. Jack's mind raced, wondering who could be out here in the wilderness, so far from the town. But he couldn't worry about that now. They had to keep moving. The trail was fading behind them, but Jack still felt the weight of it, the knowledge that someone, or something, was out there. As night fell and the shadows grew long, Jack found a small cave in the side of a hill. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. They huddled inside, the cool air seeping through the cracks in the rock. Jack leaned against the wall, his eyes scanning the entrance. Naeli sat a few feet away, her eyes closed, her body still. Jack couldn't help but admire her composure. She didn't seem rattled, even after everything they had just experienced. He, on the other hand, felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. They had no idea what was out there, or who was following them, but they couldn't afford to stop. Jack had never been afraid of the wilderness, but the uncertainty of their situation made even the most familiar places feel foreign. As they sat in silence, Jack realized just how much had changed in such a short time. He had gone from a solitary cowboy, content with his quiet life, to someone who was now responsible for another person. Naeli had become more than just a companion. She was a part of this journey now, a part of his life. Jack didn't know where this path would lead them, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't turning back. The night was still, the only sound the soft rustling of the trees and the distant calls of animals in the night. Jack sat near the entrance of the small cave, his rifle resting across his lap, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. He knew they couldn't stay here long. They had to keep moving. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth, and for a moment, Jack allowed himself to relax, just for a brief second. Naeli was sitting across from him, her back against the cold rock of the cave wall. Her posture was perfect, always alert, as though she had learned to be one with the land. Jack watched her for a moment, noting how she had changed since they first met. There was a calmness to her now, a sense of peace that came from the knowledge of her own strength. He couldn't help but wonder about her past, the things she had endured to make her the woman she was today. But he didn't ask. He respected her silence, just as she had respected his. The fire in the center of the cave was dying down, and Jack could feel the chill of the night creeping in. He added another log to the fire, watching as the flames crackled and popped, the light dancing on the walls. The warmth was a welcome relief from the cold air outside, but Jack's mind was elsewhere. He knew they were being hunted. It wasn't a feeling he could easily shake. The trail they had followed for days was growing colder, but that didn't mean they were safe. The wilderness was vast, but it was not without its dangers. Jack had learned long ago that danger could come from anywhere, even in the most serene of places. He glanced over at Naeli again. She had her eyes closed now, but her ears were always open, always listening. Jack didn't know how she did it, how she remained so calm in the face of everything they had been through. Maybe it was just the way she had always been, Or maybe it was the quiet resolve that came with surviving in a world where trust was hard to come by. We need to move at first light, Jack said quietly, his voice low and steady. Naeli opened her eyes and looked at him, her gaze steady, unwavering. She nodded once, the only sign that she had heard him. Jack didn't expect her to say anything. There was no need for words between them. They understood each other in ways that didn't require explanation. The night passed slowly, the stars above shining brightly through the small opening at the mouth of the cave. Jack had never been one for superstition, but there was something about the night sky that always seemed to calm him. The vastness of it, the feeling that they were just small parts of something much bigger, made him feel like they were not entirely alone. By dawn, Jack was already awake, packing up their gear as quietly as possible. The last thing he wanted was to attract attention. Naeli woke shortly after, moving with the same quiet efficiency she always did. Jack handed her some water and a small piece of bread, watching as she ate in silence. He knew they couldn't afford to linger, but for a moment, Jack allowed himself to enjoy the simple act of sharing a meal with someone else. They didn't speak as they made their way through the forest, the morning light filtering through the trees. Jack kept his senses sharp, always listening for the sounds of movement, the rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig. They had to remain vigilant. As they reached the edge of a small hill, Jack stopped, scanning the area. He had noticed something earlier. There was a faint trail leading off to the west, and it looked fresh. Jack motioned for Naeli to follow him, and they made their way toward it. The trail was narrow but clear, the ground soft beneath their boots. Jack led the way, his heart racing slightly as he tried to keep his thoughts focused. They couldn't afford to be discovered. Not now. They walked for hours, the trail winding through the thick forest, the trees growing taller and denser as they went. Jack didn't know where it would lead them, but he couldn't turn back. He had made a promise to himself, and to Naeli, that he wouldn't stop until they were safe. The thought of the town, of the people who would never understand what they had done, felt like a weight on his chest. But he couldn't focus on that now, not while there was still so much to be done. As the sun began to set once again, Jack felt a renewed sense of urgency. They had been walking all day, and the shadows were growing longer. They needed shelter, and soon. Jack scanned the area, his eyes landing on a small cave in the distance. It was just the right size, hidden enough to keep them out of sight. Over there, Jack said, his voice low. Naeli nodded, and they quickened their pace. As they approached the cave, Jack took one last look around, ensuring there was no sign of pursuit. He didn't want to risk being caught off guard. Once inside, they settled in for the night, the fire crackling in the center of the cave. Jack sat against the wall, his mind still racing. The quiet around them felt almost unnatural, as though the world was holding its breath. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the fire fill his senses. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or if they were truly safe. But for now, they were together, and that was all that mattered. The morning came slowly, the first light of dawn creeping through the entrance of their small cave. Jack woke up first. As usual, the chill of the night still clinging to the air. He stretched, feeling the familiar stiffness in his muscles. It had been a long journey, and each day seemed to take more out of him than the last. But they kept moving. There was no choice. He glanced over at Naeli, still sleeping a few feet away. Her face was peaceful, almost childlike in the quiet moments before she woke. Jack hadn't realized how much her presence had changed him until now. They had both been running from something, but together, they had found a strange kind of solace. The thought of leaving her behind never crossed his mind. He would not let that happen. As the sunlight grew brighter, Jack stood and began gathering their things. They had to keep moving, but he was tired of running, tired of the constant uncertainty. But deep down, he knew they couldn't afford to stop. He had made a promise to Naeli, a promise to himself. He couldn't let fear control them. By the time Naeli stirred, Jack had packed most of their supplies. She stood up slowly, stretching her limbs as she rose to her feet. Her eyes met his briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. She knew. They both knew what needed to be done. The air was cooler now, a sign that they couldn't stay too long in the cave. Jack glanced around one last time before they left, making sure no one had followed their trail. The forest was still and quiet, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of the trees and the distant calls of wildlife. "We should head east," Jack said as he shouldered his pack. There's a river about a day's walk from here. We can follow it, stay hidden until we figure out our next move. Naeli nodded, falling into step beside him without a word. Her presence was steady, like the earth beneath their feet. It was hard to imagine traveling without her now. They walked in silence, the path becoming steeper as they made their way through the thickening trees. The morning passed slowly, the only sign of time's passing being the rising sun. Jack kept his eyes on the ground, looking for any signs of movement. He had no idea who might be looking for them, but he wasn't willing to take any chances. They stopped for a short break by a small stream. Jack sat on a large rock, wiping the sweat from his brow. Naeli knelt beside the water, drinking deeply, her reflection faintly visible in the clear water. She looked up at Jack as she finished, her eyes momentarily meeting his. We'll get through this, she said quietly, her voice steady. Jack didn't respond at first. He had always preferred silence, but something in her words resonated with him. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that maybe they could make it through this, that maybe there was a chance for them to find peace. After a brief rest, they continued on, following the stream until it widened and split. Jack felt the growing sense of urgency inside him, but he knew they couldn't afford to rush. They had to stay smart. As the day wore on, the terrain became more difficult. The river was no longer their guide. Instead, they had to navigate the thick underbrush, moving slowly to avoid making noise. By evening, they had found another small cave near a rocky outcrop. Jack set up their camp quickly, keeping the fire low so as not to attract attention. They ate in silence, the firelight flickering between them, casting long shadows on the walls. Jack watched Naeli as she ate. There was something about her calmness, her ability to keep moving despite everything they had been through, that made Jack admire her even more. She wasn't afraid of the unknown, and maybe that was what had kept her alive this long. We'll rest here tonight, Jack said after a while. Tomorrow, we'll push further east. Naeli nodded, her gaze distant. She wasn't looking at him, but Jack didn't mind. The night stretched out before them, peaceful in its own way. Jack lay back, staring up at the ceiling of the cave. He could hear the wind rustling outside, the sound of the world moving on without them. But inside the cave, there was only silence, an uneasy peace. He closed his eyes, letting sleep take him, but even in his dreams, he could feel the weight of what lay ahead. They weren't safe yet. They might never be. But for now, they had each other. The morning arrived with a cool breeze, the faint rustling of leaves the only sound in the quiet forest. Jack had been awake for some time, the weight of the previous day hanging over him. The trail they had followed had grown more difficult as they moved further east. The land was rugged, and Jack could feel the strain in his muscles with each step. But he pushed it aside. They couldn't stop. Not yet. Naeli was still asleep, her dark hair spread out on the ground beside the fire. Jack looked at her for a moment, wondering what she was thinking. She had been so quiet lately, her eyes distant at times, as if she was carrying the weight of the world in silence. Jack didn't know much about her past, but he knew enough to understand that her strength wasn't born out of nothing. She had fought for survival in ways Jack couldn't begin to comprehend. And now, they were both on the run. Jack gathered the remnants of their fire, quietly packing up their camp. He moved with practiced efficiency, the sounds of the forest surrounding him, blending with his thoughts. It wasn't just the town that was after them. It was the constant uncertainty, the fear of what might happen next. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now, every part of him was telling him to keep moving. After a few moments, Naeli stirred, waking up slowly. She didn't speak immediately, just sat up and ran a hand through her tangled hair. Jack noticed the way she seemed to assess the area, as though checking for danger even in her sleep. It was a skill she had perfected over time, and Jack couldn't help but respect it. He stood, offering her a hand as she rose to her feet. We'll leave soon, Jack said quietly. Naeli nodded without saying a word, her eyes scanning the horizon. She had always been more in tune with her surroundings than he was. It wasn't that Jack didn't know how to survive in the wilderness, but Naeli seemed to have a connection to the land that Jack could only admire. As they packed up the rest of their things, Jack noticed that they were both moving with a quiet urgency. There was no time to waste. The longer they stayed in one place, the more vulnerable they became. Jack shouldered his pack, and they began walking again, the forest stretching out before them. The path was uneven, the ground damp from the morning dew, and Jack felt the weight of each step. It was difficult not to think about the danger that still lurked behind them, but Jack kept his thoughts focused on the present. They had made it this far, and they would keep going. The trees parted after a few hours, and Jack saw a small stream winding through the valley below. The sound of water was a welcome relief, and they followed the stream for a while, taking the opportunity to drink and rest. As they sat by the water, Jack felt a sense of calm settle over him. The world felt different here, quieter, as though time itself had slowed. He glanced over at Nayeli, who was sitting across from him, her eyes fixed on the water. She had a faraway look in her eyes, but there was something else there too, something Jack couldn't quite place. They sat in silence for a while, the peaceful surroundings, offering a temporary reprieve from the chaos they had left behind. Eventually, Jack stood up and started to pack their things. "We should keep moving," he said, breaking the silence. Nayeli nodded, her movements deliberate. She had always been practical, never wasting time. They continued along the stream, their pace steady but cautious. Jack didn't know how much further they would need to travel, but he knew they couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. Jack could feel the pull of exhaustion in his bones, but he pushed it aside. They had to keep moving. As the evening approached, they found a small clearing in the forest. Jack checked the surroundings carefully before setting up camp. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the night. As they ate their meager meal, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the small moments of peace they had found. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was a life they could still control. And for now, that was enough. As night settled in, the fire crackled softly between them, casting dancing shadows across their faces. Jack looked at Nayeli, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the flames. She met his gaze for a brief moment before looking back into the fire. Neither of them said anything, but Jack could feel the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them. They were survivors, both of them, and in that moment, Jack knew they would keep fighting, together. The world outside might be uncertain, but here, in the quiet of the night, they were safe, for now. The morning was quiet again, the sun rising slowly over the horizon, casting its golden light across the landscape. Jack sat by the edge of their small camp, watching as Nayeli packed their things in silence. The steady routine of moving, setting up, and breaking camp had become second nature, but the exhaustion was beginning to weigh on him more each day. His muscles ached, his body yearning for rest, but the fear of staying still was always stronger. As much as Jack wanted to stop, to rest for a few days and let their bodies recover, he knew they couldn't. They had to keep moving. He glanced over at Nayeli. She was always so composed, always calm, even now. He wondered how she did it, how she maintained such focus, such resilience, in the face of everything they had endured. But maybe that was just who she was. Jack had learned long ago not to ask questions people weren't ready to answer, and Nayeli had never volunteered any details about her past. She kept her thoughts to herself, her emotions carefully guarded. He admired that about her. It was a strength Jack couldn't quite match. After a few moments, Jack stood up and stretched, pushing the thoughts aside. "We should get moving," he said, his voice steady. Nayeli nodded without a word, and they finished packing their gear. Jack didn't need to ask her twice. She had always been efficient, always ready to go, even when it seemed like they had no destination. They both knew that the wilderness was their only safe place, and for now, that would have to be enough. As they walked, Jack kept his eyes on the ground, watching the path unfold before him. The trees here were thick, their branches heavy with leaves. He couldn't see much beyond the dense undergrowth, but he didn't need to. He trusted his instincts, and right now, his instincts were telling him they needed to move quickly. The quiet of the forest surrounded them, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was the same feeling he had when they had first left the town, the sense that they weren't truly alone. He glanced at Nayeli, but her face was impassive, unreadable. She didn't seem to share his unease. Perhaps that was the difference between them. Jack was always aware of the danger around him, always on edge. But Nayeli, it seemed, was at peace in the world she knew. Jack shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts from his mind. They couldn't afford to dwell on what might happen. They had to focus on the present. After a few hours of walking, They reached a small ridge that overlooked a valley below. The sight of it made Jack pause for a moment, his breath catching in his chest. It was beautiful in a way that only the wilderness could be, vast, untouched, and full of life. He hadn't realized how much he missed this. The quiet of the mountains, the endless stretch of land, the feeling of being truly free. "This is as good a place as any," Jack said, breaking the silence. Naeli didn't respond, but stepped forward, her eyes scanning the valley. Jack followed her lead, setting up their camp near the edge of the ridge. They didn't need much, just a small fire to cook and keep warm. As the night settled in, Jack watched the stars begin to appear in the sky above them, the darkness swallowing up the world around them. The fire crackled softly between them, its warmth a welcome relief from the cool mountain air. Jack sat back, his body aching from the long days of travel, but he didn't let himself relax too much. They had to be ready for anything. "We'll stay here tonight," Jack said. Naeli gave a small nod, sitting a little farther away, her eyes never leaving the horizon. Jack didn't know what she was thinking, but he could feel the weight of her silence. It was the same silence they had shared since they left the town, the silence that spoke volumes without ever needing words. They both carried their own burdens, their own pasts, and neither was willing to share them yet. Jack understood that. In some ways, he didn't need to know. They had found a kind of unspoken understanding, a bond forged in the quiet moments of survival. As the fire flickered and the stars filled the sky above them, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of peace for the first time in a long time. The world was still uncertain, the future unclear, but for now, they were together. And in that moment, it was enough. The morning broke with a quiet stillness, the sun casting its first light across the jagged peaks of the mountains. Jack Cooper awoke early, his body stiff from the cold night, spent in the small cave. The fire had long since burned out, leaving only the faint scent of wood smoke in the air. He stretched, feeling the soreness in his muscles. The journey had been harder than he had anticipated, but they had made it this far, and that was something to be proud of. Naeli was still asleep, her face calm in the dim light. Jack glanced over at her for a moment, wondering what she was dreaming about. He had spent so many years alone, but now, with her by his side, the solitude didn't seem so overwhelming. The silence between them was comfortable, not awkward, like two people who had found something unspoken and precious. Jack stood, brushing the dirt and leaves off his pants, and began packing their things. The routine of breaking camp had become second nature, but today, there was something different in the air. Maybe it was the way the sun filtered through the trees, or the stillness that surrounded them, but Jack could feel the weight of the journey pressing down on him. They had come so far, but the road ahead was still uncertain. The world outside the safety of their small camp was vast and dangerous, and Jack knew they couldn't stay in one place for too long. He couldn't afford to relax, not yet. After a few moments, Naeli stirred, waking with a soft groan. She sat up slowly, her eyes squinting against the early light, and Jack handed her some water. "We should leave soon," he said, his voice low. Naeli nodded without speaking, always ready to move, always aware of the need to stay one step ahead. She was a woman of few words, but Jack had come to understand that her silence spoke volumes. They both had a past they weren't eager to share, but together, they had found a way to survive. As they packed up their camp and began their journey, Jack couldn't help but notice the way Naeli moved through the forest, quiet, sure, as though she had always belonged here. Her gaze never wavered, always alert to the sounds around them, always scanning the horizon. Jack, too, kept his senses sharp, his mind focused on the task at hand. They walked for hours, the terrain becoming increasingly rugged, the path more difficult to follow. The dense trees and underbrush made progress slow, but they kept moving, their footsteps synchronized, a quiet rhythm in the wilderness. The air grew heavier, the sky overcast, as if warning them that a storm might be coming. By midday, Jack had begun to feel the exhaustion creeping in. His body ached from the constant walking, his muscles sore from carrying their supplies. But they couldn't stop. Not yet. They needed to find a safer place, somewhere they could rest without the constant fear of being discovered. The forest eventually gave way to a small clearing, the tall grass swaying gently. In the breeze, Jack stopped, looking around, his instincts telling him that they had reached a good spot to take a break. "We'll rest here," he said, his voice hoarse from the dryness in his throat. Naeli nodded and dropped her pack to the ground. Jack quickly set about gathering firewood, while Naeli sat by the edge of the clearing, her eyes scanning the surroundings. Jack respected the way she always seemed to be on edge, always alert, always ready. As he built the fire, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. They had made it through another day, and for the moment, they were safe. The fire crackled as they sat around it, the warmth a welcome relief from the chill in the air. They ate their meager meal in silence, the only sounds the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant call of a bird. Jack glanced at Naeli, watching the way the firelight flickered across her face. She didn't speak, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet determination that Jack admired. They were both survivors. They had been through things that most people couldn't imagine, and yet here they were, still standing. As the night deepened, Jack leaned back against a tree, his eyes fixed on the stars above. The vastness of the sky always had a way of making him feel small, insignificant even, but there was a comfort in it too. In this moment, they were just two people, alone in the wilderness, doing what they had to in order to survive. He turned his head slightly to see Naeli still sitting by the fire, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the flames. She seemed lost in thought, her expression distant, but Jack knew that she was always aware of what was happening around them. He couldn't imagine what she had been through, what had brought her to this point, but he had a feeling that, whatever it was, it had made her stronger. Jack was no stranger to hardship, but he knew that Naeli had faced things he could never fully understand. And yet, she had survived. They both had. The fire flickered one last time before dying down, the embers glowing softly in the darkness. Jack stood, brushing the dirt off his pants, and gathered the remaining wood. As he settled down beside Naeli, he realized that, for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from certainty or safety, but the kind that came from knowing they had made it through another day. And for now, that was enough. The next morning arrived with a quiet stillness, the light of dawn creeping slowly over the mountain ridges. Jack Cooper woke up first, stretching out stiff limbs, feeling the familiar ache from days of traveling through the rugged wilderness. He glanced over at Naeli, still fast asleep, her form curled up near the remnants of their campfire. Jack had grown used to the silence between them, a comfortable quiet that didn't need words. The weight of their journey hung between them like a shared understanding, neither needing to speak of the danger they were constantly evading. After a few moments, Jack stood, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The world around them seemed peaceful, as if nature had forgotten the turmoil that came with the world of men. He moved quietly, gathering their belongings, not wanting to disturb Naeli's rest. As he packed, Jack's mind wandered. The thought of the town, the people they had left behind, still clung to him. He could almost hear the murmurs of the crowd, the angry voices, the sheriff's unsure stance. It had been days since they'd left, but the memory lingered. Jack hadn't expected to feel the weight of their departure so deeply. There had been no real goodbyes, no time to process what they were leaving behind. But now, as he stood there alone in the wilderness, he realized that leaving had been necessary. The past was behind them, and the future was uncertain. But they had each other, and that was enough for now. As Naeli stirred awake, Jack turned to her, offering a quiet smile. She gave him a small nod in return, her eyes still heavy with sleep. She was always composed, but there was a softness about her that Jack had begun to notice. It was in the way she held herself, in the quiet strength that she exuded, despite the hard circumstances. She was a survivor, and so was he. Together, they had become a team, bound by the shared experience of survival. After a few moments of quiet, Naeli stood, her movements slow but purposeful. Jack handed her some water, and they both shared a small breakfast in silence. They didn't need much. It was a habit they had both grown into, finding strength in the simplest of things. Once their camp was packed and ready, Jack motioned for them to move on. The path ahead was familiar yet foreign, a constant reminder of how little they truly knew about the wilderness they now called home. Jack led the way, his boots crunching against the dirt, as they made their way through the forest. The trees loomed tall and silent around them, their shadows stretching long across the ground. Jack could feel the weight of the journey settling into his bones, but he pushed it aside. There was no time for fatigue. They had to keep moving. The landscape around them changed as they traveled, the dense forest eventually giving way to an open plain. Jack paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. The vastness of the open land felt like a sea of emptiness, but at the same time, it brought a sense of freedom. There were no walls here, no towns to fear, just the open sky and the endless stretch of earth beneath their feet. But with the freedom came the fear. Jack knew that danger could be lurking anywhere, and he couldn't afford to be caught off guard. "We need to find shelter before the nightfall," Jack said, his voice steady. Naeli nodded, her eyes already scanning the surrounding land. She had always been more aware of their surroundings, her senses sharper, and Jack trusted her instincts. They continued their journey across the plains, walking steadily, knowing they had to find a safe place to rest before darkness fell. The sun began to dip low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the land. Jack felt the fatigue in his legs, but they couldn't stop yet. As they moved, Jack noticed the way Naeli seemed to be taking in every detail, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze darted between the horizon and the earth beneath their feet. She was always aware, always alert. Jack couldn't help but admire her. She was strong in a way that made him feel like he still had much to learn. They eventually reached a small cluster of rocks, perfect for shelter. Jack motioned toward the formation, and they made their way toward it. As night fell, they set up camp, the fire crackling between them. The stars began to appear above, and the cold of the night air set in. Jack looked at Naeli, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the flames. She didn't speak, but Jack could tell she was thinking about something far away. Her eyes held a distant look, as if she was seeing a different world entirely. Jack didn't ask. He had learned not to. The silence between them was enough. They sat around the fire for a while, the crackling of the wood the only sound in the night. Jack's mind wandered back to the road ahead, to the journey that was far from over. But for now, in this moment, he was grateful. They had made it through another day. They were still alive, still moving forward, and that was enough. The following day dawned gray, clouds gathering in the sky, a subtle promise of rain. Jack Cooper woke to the sound of soft rustling outside their shelter. He sat up quickly, instinctively reaching for his rifle, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw that it was just the wind moving the tall grass. The world seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for something to happen. The campfire had burned down to just embers, the faint orange glow illuminating the darkening sky. Jack stood up slowly, stretching his aching body. His muscles still carried the wear of the previous days, but it was the kind of tiredness that came with survival, hard-earned, but not defeating. He turned to see Naeli still asleep, her silhouette curled on the ground, wrapped in the thin blanket she had. She hadn't stirred yet, and for a moment, Jack allowed himself to watch her. She looked peaceful, more vulnerable than he had seen her before, without the guarded expression she usually wore. He admired her strength, how she carried herself through each day, never faltering, always focused. Jack knew her resolve came from more than just surviving. There was something deeper, something unspoken, that kept her going. Jack's thoughts were interrupted when Naeli stirred, her eyes slowly opening to meet his. She didn't say anything right away, but she didn't need to. Her steady gaze told him everything he needed to know. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared understanding that didn't require words. "We should keep moving," Jack said quietly, breaking the stillness. Naeli nodded, slowly rising to her feet. The morning air was cool, and the sky above them seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. Jack could feel the weight of their journey pressing down on him, but he knew they had no choice. They had to keep moving. They packed their camp in silence, the familiar routine of it almost comforting in its predictability. Jack shouldered his pack and led the way as they walked deeper into the wilderness. The path ahead was winding, difficult to navigate, but they had learned to adjust. The landscape had shifted since they first arrived, with dense forest giving way to open fields, wide stretches of grass that seemed endless. Jack could see the clouds thickening in the distance, signaling the approaching storm. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain, and Jack knew they didn't have much time. They needed to find shelter before the storm hit. As they walked, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was the same feeling he had felt when they first left the town, the sense of being watched. The feeling that someone or something was always just behind them. He glanced at Nayeli, but her expression was calm, her eyes scanning the horizon. She didn't seem to share his unease, but Jack knew better than to ignore his instincts. They had always served him well. After a few hours of walking, they came across a small cabin tucked away in a grove of trees. The place was old, the wood weathered by years of exposure to the elements. Jack approached cautiously, his rifle ready, but as he drew closer, he saw no signs of life. The cabin appeared abandoned. "This might be our best option for shelter," Jack said, looking over at Nayeli. She gave a small nod, and they carefully made their way inside. The interior was dusty, the air musty, but it was dry, and that was all that mattered for now. They built a small fire in the corner, its warmth offering a welcome relief from the growing chill outside. Jack kept a vigilant watch, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The storm had begun in earnest now, the wind howling through the trees and rain pelting against the cabin walls. Jack and Nayeli sat in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. Jack's mind wandered back to the journey so far, to the quiet moments they had shared. They had both been through so much, but they had made it this far, together. Jack didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, as he watched the rain pour down outside, he knew one thing. No matter what happened, they would face it together. The storm raged through the night, but inside the cabin, there was a fragile peace. Jack sat against the wall, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but his thoughts were always on alert. Nayeli had already fallen asleep, her body curled up near the fire. Jack could feel the weight of their journey, the uncertainty that loomed ahead, but he also felt something else, something deeper. They had survived so much together, and that alone gave him hope. No matter what came next, they had each other.